Thank you, everyone, for being here this afternoon. Thanks for inviting me, David, and the rest of the crew who is putting on this great space for us. I really appreciate the chance to just spend a little bit of time with everyone here. It was a really beautiful um, introduction that we had with all of these different prayers and readings from thinkers who are trying to help us navigate into this new reality that we are confronted with as an American nation. We're speaking here primarily as Americans in this global context, I think. And I wanted to start out by saying that, you know, in the Baha'i faith, there is no clergy, right? There's no one who is considered to be above another. Each of us is responsible for the independent investigation of truth. And in that last prayer that was read from Abdul Baha, in the last lines it said, "May we all," and then there's several things that it asks, and Abdul Baha offers up this prayer that says, "May we all seek the mysteries of the kingdom." And in this day and age, like all of us have the capacity to do that, to access knowledge and critical thinking and rationality and the spirit and determine for ourselves what is truth. And in fact, we are bidden to pursue that investigation of truth independently as best we can. And so today, the ideas that I want to share with you are, they're only my ideas. They come from having thought about the Baha'i faith for a long time. It was a religion that I was raised in. And then also attempting to correlate the ideas and the principles that first emerged from the revelation of Baha'u'llah, who is the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, correlating those ideas and principles and insights with the discourses that exist in our society, and particularly those that I'm familiar with from my studies and reading as a professor of primarily African American literature, but American culture and history more generally. So I have a few ideas that I want to share today, and the name of the title of the presentation that I want to offer is "New Wine and New Bottles: Race, Justice, Unity, and the Baha'i Faith." And if you don't mind, I'm just going to share my screen here to maybe give y'all something to look at besides me. That would probably be a good idea. So the place that I want to begin is really right in our moment that we find ourselves. And many uh, many people are sort of observing the landscape, if you will, the social landscape, and recognizing that we are at what seems to be a kind of critical inflection point in American history and America's conception of itself. And the Universal House of Justice, which is the administrative body which leads the affairs of the Baha'i faith in the world today, has written to the American Baha'i community telling us that indeed we are at this moment of historic portent, meaning to my mind that we are on the verge of moving into new territory, right? We are on a journey in this ever advancing civilization of humanity that is, I think, at a period that we could think of as adolescence. We are moving out of our childhood as a collective humanity and moving into a maturity. And in this period between childhood and maturity, there is an adolescence in which there is great chaos. And at this point in American society, I think that we can look around and we can see that there are these competing forces that are operating in society. And some seem to be hearkening back to the old, wanting to bring us back to times of the past. And then others are moving us into these new conceptions, these new ways of thinking about social reality and our relationships to one another as human beings. And I thought that one interesting way of conceiving of this moment that we are in brings us back to the gospel and thinking about this parable of Christ that probably many people know, the Pharisees were asking Christ, how come your followers aren't fasting twice a day like they're supposed to be, like the Pharisees are teaching. And they're saying to Christ, you're teaching them something wrong. And he responds by saying this sort of famous line, at least for me, is something I grew up with, always thinking about. I think it's just a beautiful idea and concept, and very versatile in terms of the way that we can apply it to aspects of reality. And he said, and no man putteth new wine into old bottles, else the new wine burst the bottles and be spilled, and the bottle shall perish. But new wine must be put into new bottles, and both are preserved. Right. And so Christ was saying that this new revelation that he had, it could not fit within these old traditions. Right. And that it was going to create a kind of fracture within these old traditions. And it seems to me that in terms of our development as a humanity, an entire humanity, we are in a similar place of needing to leave behind old traditions in order to embrace a possible future. And so I think of the new wine that is animating our age as a kind of new energy, a new spirit, new insight. And a lot of it has to do with recognizing the sacred nature of every human being, that every human being is endowed with rights and privileges that come from the divine creator. And in some ways, there is this kind of recognition that is permeating in human consciousness right now. And it's spurred on not only by, of course, religious thinking, but also by scientific thinking, which is making us understand that we're all the same. 99%, of our DNA essentially is the same, right? Each one of us possesses this kind of miracle of consciousness within our minds. And that mind is the product of a evolutionary process in which infinitely complex cells are joining together to create, you know, this wondrous thing, which is a human being. And all of us, no matter where we are in the world or what station we have in society, we all possess this incredibly sacred and mysterious reality, right? And we're bound together. And as more and more people recognize that kind of oneness, there's a new energy, right? But we have these old bottles, right? These old ways of interacting with one another that are based on tradition, that are based on separation and disunity and attempts to exploit differences between human beings, right? And those old bottles, we can feel them bursting apart. We can see them breaking apart. And if we take it back to that parable of Christ, right? The references to these wineskins that they had, right? And when they kept the wine in these they called them bottles, but they were actually skins, they would expand. And when they were old, if you put new wine into it and that wine started fermenting, the brittleness of the stretched wineskin would cause it to burst, right? And I think that if we look around at the headlines of the news today, we can see metaphorically the wineskins of society bursting, right? Some of the traditions in our sort of democratic processes are breaking apart in America, right? Some of the assumptions and the hierarchies, they're beginning to break apart, and it's causing this kind of chaotic moment, right? And in order to deal with this new spirit of oneness and this new recognition that every life is sacred and every life needs to be honored, we need to create these new structures of thought and behavior. And we need to have new institutional structures and new community structures that can channel this energy. And I think that, as a Baha'i, these new structures, these new behaviors, and so forth, they need to honor the reality of the oneness of humanity. And of course, this idea of the oneness of humanity comes from the very center of the revelation of Baha'u'llah. It is the point around which everything in Baha'u'llah's revelation pivots. And he says that the fundamental purpose animating the faith of God and his religion is to safeguard the interests and promote the unity of the human race and to foster the spirit of love and fellowship amongst men. That's the only purpose of Baha'u'llah's revelation, is to bring about this unity of the human race. And oftentimes Baha'u'llah would talk about the human race as would talk about it metaphorically in terms of the body, right? And the body, as I've said before, as I was mentioning before, with the kind of like the mysterious complexity of human consciousness, which comes out of the mind, right? The brain. There are so many different cells that go into the structure of the brain and the structure of the pulmonary system or the olfactory system or our skin or any element of our body, and each one of those elements of our body organs is made up of cells, right? And these cells are infinitely diverse, yet they don't work against one another, right? When the body is properly functioning, they work in harmony with one another. And Baha'u'llah, he said that his revelation was meant to bring about this harmony in the body of humanity so that its various elements could operate in all of its diversity, yet at the same time harmoniously. So one of the things that I think is interesting to sort of consider is that if we want to create these new ways of thinking and these new institutional structures and community structures which are capable of maintaining this new energy that we feel in a globalized world, recognizing and grappling with the reality of the oneness of humanity, is we have to have new stories about who we are, right, as human beings, and new visions about who we are. And so one of the things that I'm interested in as a student myself and somebody who teaches is the historical vision which has developed within, I think, all of humanity, but particularly within America, about human beings, essentially these categories of human beings that we saw evoked in the opening readings of the devotional gathering just a few moments ago, right? This idea of race, right? And we have a certain kind of historical vision which shapes our idea of race. And in order for us to understand, I think, a future, in order for us to develop a prophetic vision, we have to re-examine our historical vision. And this is a kind of process that is very much underwritten in the scriptures of almost every religious faith, right? When the new manifestation of God, the new prophet of God appears within a society, oftentimes he places himself in the context of history. And Baha'u'llah did that in one of his most important books called the Kitab-i-Igan. He starts out this very important text of his by rehearsing the history of the appearance of prophets of God in the past. And once he rehearses that history, he's able to establish the character of the day in which he lives, right? And then the character of the day in which he lived offers up the opportunity to prophesy a future, right? And so in order for us to understand where we're going, we have to understand where we've been. And this is a common idea. And we have to have this kind of vision of, we know from Proverbs that where there is no vision, the people perish, of course, right? And so we're developing, I think, new stories about who we are as a people, as a nation. And in order for us to work our way into the future, people have recognized that it's necessary for us to develop these new stories. And one of the ways that we can think about that, right, is the 1619 project, probably which many of you all are familiar with, right? And in the 1619 project, we have a new story of American history, right? We have this story of American history that begins not with that traditional starting point, which is 1776, the one that most of us are taught in school or have been taught in school. And we see it being paired with a new date, right? The 1619 date, in which enslaved Africans first appeared on the shores of North America as enslaved people, right? And by offering up this new story, we begin to develop a new sense of who we are as a nation and what this nation is about, and who are the people who might be centered in understandings of the nation and of who we are. And of course, this has created a lot of tension, right? There's a lot of people who don't want to give up on that 1776 date. And there are many people who are insisting on the efficacy, the truth of the 1619 date. And of course, one could argue that both perspectives have a kind of validity, right? Um, Certain truths can seem to be contradictory, right? But can simultaneously both be accurate, right? If you are sitting where I am in California and you look to the east every morning and you see the sun rising, well, you would say, well, obviously the sun rises in the east. But if we were, and that's the fundamental truth of the matter, right? But if we extend ourselves up into this perspective of someone sitting on the moon and we're looking at the sun and its relationship to the earth, right? We wouldn't say necessarily that the sun rises in the east or it sets in the west, right? We have this new perspective, right? Or if we are inside of a train, right, and that train is moving 60 miles an hour and there's a fly inside the train, right? And that fly is buzzing next to us, we might say that that fly is moving at a very slow rate. But if we're standing outside the train and looking at the train fly by and the fly is in that train, we could say that fly is moving at 60 miles an hour, like the train is. And so there are these different perspectives that can be simultaneously true. But when we begin to take them, right, depending on which perspective we take, we may begin to develop new ideas and new ways of thinking about the subject matter. And so one of the things that I wanted to suggest is that we could begin to even change our stories a little bit more by offering up something like a 1319 project, right? And so in this idea of the 1319 project, we take ourselves 300 years past that moment when enslaved people from Africa first set foot on North America. And we can take ourselves into West Africa. We travel eastward back across the Atlantic in the opposite direction of the Middle Passage that we know about, right? And we travel backwards in times 300 years. And what we find ourselves is that we're in the midst of one of the greatest empires on earth at that time, which is the Mali Empire. And the Mali Empire existed in West Africa and places that are today the political entities that operate there are known as Mali and Senegal and other places, right? And what we find is that the Emperor Mansa Musa is beginning his reign, right? And one might say that the apex moment in his reign comes in 1324 when Mansa Musa makes his pilgrimage as a Muslim to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. And so he has to go all the way across the Sahara. And once he passes the Sahara, he goes into Cairo and then eventually down into the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, into Mecca and Medina. And on that trip with him, he has a retinue that numbers in the thousands. The historians think it could be between 20,000 or 60,000 people that he brought across the Sahara Desert with him. And imagine that spectacle. Africans from the western part of the continent coming into North Africa with thousands and thousands in the entourage. And Mansa Musa was in control of the most important gold mines of the world in that era. And so on this caravan that he traveled with, there were hundreds, perhaps as many as 600 camels, each one of which was weighed down by 100 pounds of gold dust. And he carried that with him. And when he got to Cairo, he dispensed with all of this gold, buying up as many things as people had on offer, so much so that the economy of that area of the world, of North Africa and the Mediterranean region, was destabilized because so much gold was flowing into the economies of that region. That's how powerful Mansa Musa was. Some say he was the most wealthy man who ever lived in the history of humanity. And yet we don't really know about him, right? But one of the things that is also important to think about is that Mansa Musa wasn't just showing off his wealth when he made this pilgrimage right? He was, of course, following his religious obligation. But on the other hand, he was also attempting to attract resources, intellectual, primarily human resources, back into West Africa. And he was successful in doing that. Many of the great political minds and artistic minds, architectural minds of that era were drawn back into the Mali Empire when Mansa Musa returned. And after his reign, or during his reign, he began to build up the fabled city of Timbuktu, right? And in the 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu arises as one of the great centers of intellectual development in all of the world. One could say that it is among the beating hearts of the intellectual circulation system that was going on in the world in that period of what we call antiquity, before modernity, before the European Renaissance and so forth, right? And so all of these great minds of jurisprudence and astronomy and surgery and political science and poetry, they were centered in Timbuktu in the Mali Empire. And yet, of course, right, we are not really aware of this history. And but the people of that time were. This is a Spanish this is the work of a Spanish cartographer, and you can see Mansa Musa there in the kind of like the heart of West Africa, sitting on this throne with a golden scepter, a golden crown, and a nugget in his hand, meaning that he was very well known. And of course, people were drawn to, attracted to this kingdom for all types of reasons, right? But of course, we're not really familiar with that. And we know why most of us maybe have no familiarity with the figure of Mansa Musa, right? And it's because of a way in which we have told stories about what humanity is and who we are as human beings that we're not familiar with that. And of course, it seems to me that we can't really begin to develop a unified understanding of humanity if we are degrading, right, certain parts of this human family, right? This new wine of the recognition of the oneness of humanity cannot fit within these old structures of thought, right? These old bottles, these old structures of thought, which degrade, marginalize, and denigrate certain aspects, certain branches of the human family. So one of the things that I always found like fascinating when thinking about the development of the quote unquote new world was the fact that I had always conceived of it as a kind of European project, right? That Europeans after 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, came to the Caribbean and North America, South America, and Central America and built up these new societies on the other side of the Atlantic. But then I came across some data that really forced me to alter my conceptions of what the New World Project really was all about. And if we think about the people who came across the Atlantic from 1492 and 17 to 1776, those first 300 years, you could say, of New World history, right? And we think about them as immigrants. And we know that the Africans who made that migration were not willing immigrants, but of course, forced immigrants, right? We realize that there are 6.5 million people who made that journey and who began to build up this so-called new world in a place where people had been living for thousands of years. In fact, right where I'm sitting right now is the land of the Tongva people. And before the Spanish came into this area, coming up from Mexico, their societies have been existing for as much as 5,000 years in this area, right? But we still, of course, we know that we call it the New World erroneously. But when we realize that 6.5 million people made this journey from the old world to the new world, we should think about how many of those people were African, right? And we may have certain numbers in our minds. But I remember the first time I saw this figure, it kind of blew my mind, right? Because what we recognize is that more than 80% of the people who made that journey across the Atlantic in the first 300 years of New World history were African, right? So what does that mean? That means, to my mind, that what we exist within today, the societies, right, the nations, the social structures, the infrastructure, agricultural, epistemological ways of understanding the world and so forth, were heavily influenced and perhaps primarily built up by people who came from nations such as the Wolof people, right, or the Akan people, or the Igbo people, or the Yoruba people, or the Hausa people, right? All of these diverse Africans were enslaved and taken across the Atlantic Ocean. And in that process of going through the Middle Passage and in this New World enslavement, this diversity of people became known under the category of Black, right? And as that process was going on, we also saw a similar process happening among Europeans. And so we had Protestants and Catholics, Spanish and Portuguese and French and Dutch and English, all amalgamating into this category of white. Right. And what we know is that these people who amalgamated into this category of white were able to exploit and stigmatize those who were amalgamated into that category of Black. And so these are created categories. We see that the creation of race, the creation of whiteness and Blackness exist for the purpose of the exploitation, economic exploitation of resources in the new world. That's primarily where our modern conception of these categories emerges from, right? And so, we all know the history about the Caribbean basin being used to um, raise up crops such as sugar and tobacco primarily, and that it was on the raising up of those crops that great economic power was built up in European coffers, right? And so there was an incredible degree of exploitation that was essential to the creation of massive wealth. Right, the massive wealth that is now housed within primarily the banking system of Europe and its sort of child political entities like America, right? And so when we look at a place that is beautiful and opulent, right, in Europe, like the Paris of Versailles, probably some of you have visited that in your, travels to Paris, perhaps, right? One of the things that we can recognize implicitly when we look at a structure like that was built up very much during like the 17th and 18th centuries, is that the wealth that is on display in these ostentatious kinds of buildings and the great architectural wonders of Europe was not so far removed from the exploited labor of people like in the colonies of the French, primarily for in the 18th and 19th centuries, or the 18th century for France, the colony of Haiti, right? The nation that we call Haiti today, which we know at this very moment is enduring a kind of turmoil and intensity of political instability and economic, you could say, exploitation and degradation that is rooted back in that project of colonialism that started some 400 or 500 years ago and continues to have these kinds of effects today. And so in those beautiful buildings of Paris, right, what we can understand it is that it was the exploited labor of enslaved Africans in some of those French colonies that were the foundation upon which that great wealth was created. And so we can think not just about European power and the way that it was created through the exploitation of Black labor in the early periods of the New World history, but then we can begin to think, of course, about America. And we know that in the 19th century, America began its kind of meteoric rise onto the global economic scene, right? And that meteoric rise was founded upon the most widely traded commodity of the 19th century, and which that commodity which America produced in such great abundance, right, was cotton. And so in the late part of the 18th century, but primarily in the early decades of the 19th century, we see America begin to churn out hundreds and thousands of bales of cotton per day, right? And it gets shipped over to primarily England, where upon the wealth that has been created in the early years of colonialism, we see the rise of industrialism and factory production and textile factories. So there's a great desire to create textiles to put onto the world market, and the most important commodity for creating those textiles, the raw goods, if you will, that were needed, were coming out of the southern plantations, right, of America in the early parts of the 19th century. Okay. And so, of course, cotton was that most important commodity of the early 19th century in the US. And one of the things that it was is quite fascinating to think about, right, is that oftentimes we think of the enslavement of Africans in America in terms of the labor, the sheer labor that was stolen, right? And I kind of think, for some reason, when I think of labor, I think of manual labor, and embedded in that sense of manual labor is the term man, right? And so you have this masculine notion of men doing labor, right? But one of the things that's quite fascinating and perhaps horrifying to think about is the way in which it was the exploitation of women's labor, right, on these southern cotton plantations that you could say was at the heart of the 19th century economy and the rise of American economic power in that 19th century. And if we look back to something like the slave narrative of Solomon Northup, which has been made into a film, 12 Years a Slave. Probably some of you all saw it. There is a character played by Lupita Nyong'o, Patsy. And Patsy, according to Solomon Northup, who was, he was born free in Saratoga Springs in New York, and tricked into coming down to Washington D.C., where he was kidnapped and then sent for 12 years into some of the harshest cotton plantations in places like Louisiana. And when he was in this one region of Louisiana, he came upon Patsy, formed a friendship with her. And one of the things that he notes is that her labor was some of the most coveted in that entire region. She could pick cotton faster than anyone in that bayou region that he was in. And of course, that's because cotton picking was a trick of manual dexterity. I mean, dexterity with the hands. It wasn't just about how much you could carry or how much you could push or how many muscles you had, right? It was about how fast you could go down the line of cotton with your hands. And Patsy and many other women were, of course, quite effective, in their use of hands, right? And of course, we have to understand that that system, which allowed for the great production of cotton, was in essence a torture system, right? There was no monetary reward for being a good cotton picker, but there was a disincentive for not picking well. And that disincentive was the whip, right? So if you had a quota that you were meant to meet for a day and you didn't meet that quota, then the punishment was a certain number of lashes. And Solomon Northup and others in their narratives record that, right? And those who were lashed were not just men, but also women. And so one of the ways that we have to really think about the brutality of the system makes me kind of take a step back and justify the telling or even the rehearsal of this kind of history. And so I tell oftentimes this sort of metaphorical anecdote about having lost my keys in the parking lot of a very large and dark parking structure late one night. And I lost the keys, and I decided to look for them underneath a lamppost. And usually, or after a little while of looking, other people saw me looking for my keys, and then they were followed by other people. And finally, there was one person who said, "What are y'all doing?" As we were frantically looking for the keys. And I said, "We're looking for my keys." And the person said, "Well, why are you looking under here, under the lamppost where the light is?" And I said, "Well," and she asked me, "Did you lose your keys underneath this lamppost?" And I said, "No, I didn't lose my keys underneath the lamppost, but this is where the light is. So that's where I'm going to look." Right. And so obviously the meaning of this metaphorical story, right, is that oftentimes if we really want to find the keys to understanding, If we really want to truly investigate reality, we have to look not just in those light places, but in those dark places. And if we think about the real darkness of the history of American economic power, one of the things that we realize is that people like Patsy were not just exploited for their labor, but they were also exploited for sexual ends, right? So if someone like Patsy caught the eye of an overseer, right, or any person of power, or white male of power in that plantation ecology, if you will, he might embark on a sort of project of systematic rape, essentially, right? And so someone like Patsy might fall pregnant due to a rape, and although pregnant, have to go out the next day, right, to pick cotton. And when she picked cotton and the child grew within her womb, she might slow down in her labor. And if she slowed down in her labor and didn't meet her quota, there's the possibility that she could be whipped for that, right? So what you would have is women who were pregnant, not picking fast enough, being tortured in the production of cotton, which was at the heart of the economic rise of America in the early 19th century. And that wasn't just something that happened for a few years, right, or a few decades. If we look across the span of colonial history in the Western hemisphere, what we see is that there were centuries of that type of brutality. In fact, one could say that perhaps in the whole history of humanity, there are few kinds of systems that are as long lived and as exploitative and as violent as that system of plantation slavery, which existed for 400 years or so in the early part of the New World history that we are sort of the inheritors of today. Now, that cotton plantation economy was not just localized in places like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, and so forth. It had its tentacles spreading out into different parts of the global economy, obviously into the northern states where you had the banking centers of New York and Boston, where if you were a small proprietor of a plantation, you were going to seek funding from, right? If you need to buy more enslaved people, where you're going to get the money to do that, you're going to seek some kind of bank loan. And those banks were primarily centered in places like Boston and New York, but also in Zurich and London, right? So these American cotton plantations had, as I said, tendrils or tentacles going into other parts of the global economy. And there, of course, was the shipping industry and the and marketing and textile and all of that. That was all kind of connected to this cotton plantation economy of the southern states of the US in the early 19th century. And it was in that whole kind of like production era of early industrialism that we see this great bifurcation, this great kind of ascent of economic power, right, among European nations and America. And that was all dependent on this incredible kind of exploitation. And of course, in order to endure and countenance, look at this kind of exploitation, you have to have this massive story that legitimates that exploitation, right? You have to say that there's some reason that these people who are being exploited on a daily basis and who are subjected to such violence, right, are worthy and deserving of this kind of exploitation and violence. And so you have to develop an ideology that justifies that, and we might call that ideology anti-blackness, right? All the ideas which stigmatize, right, our conceptions of blackness come out of that New World history, that effort to create different categories of human beings so that one category could be exploited. And that was really essential to the creation of the modern world. And it wasn't just as though, it wasn't as though this was coming from people who weren't that critical to consciousness of, let's say, the 18th or 19th century, right? They were coming from the very apex positions in the world intellectual, the world structures of intellectual development. So people like Thomas Jefferson, who gave us the kinds of blueprints for modern democracy that many nations abide by even today, right? If we read his notes from the state of Virginia, we can see the way in which there is this incredible degradation of blackness. And yet at the same time, if we also look to his family history, we can see that although there was this incredible anti-blackness going on and that was propagated by someone like him, there was also a exploitation in the sexual realm of not only Jefferson, but that whole environment, right? So this is the Jefferson family tree, and what you can see is that Martha Wales, who was Jefferson's first wife, right, was actually the half sister of Sally Hemings, who was the enslaved young girl, right, who Thomas Jefferson had a decades long relationship to after Martha Wales died, right? And so they were actually half sisters because Martha Wales' father himself also had an enslaved woman who he produced children with, right? And that woman, Elizabeth Hemings, right, an enslaved woman, gave birth to Sally Hemings. And then together with Thomas Jefferson, uh, she gave birth to at least four children that the DNA records have demonstrated to be true. And so you can just look at that family tree and see the sort of like the twisted nature of the racial reality of that we inherit today. And it's not just people like Jefferson are sort of known for their slave holding um, histories, but also people that we tend to revere. And in fact, people who work for great change and advancement in American society, like Abraham Lincoln, was also poisoned by this ideology of anti-blackness. So it wasn't just a few people, right, who were believing this. It was across the board. And I think at this point, most of you who are here today, you're already aware of that. But this had such a powerful effect that it couldn't just last, until the end of slavery. Of course, it subsists and it continues on with us today. And in order for us, I think, to really kind of think about a future of a unified humanity, we need to have new stories about who we are. And this is, many people are aware of this. And this is why you have these new histories that are coming up and so forth, right? But we also need to have new stories of identity. And in the Baha'i Faith, one of the things that Baha'u'llah has taught is that every human being is created noble, right? In those readings that were um, the preamble to this talk here, we see that Baha'u'llah is saying, know ye not why I have created you all from the same dust, right? That no one should exalt himself above the other, right? That we are all created equally, right? But in order for us to do that inside of the history that we inherit, it was necessary for Baha'u'llah to offer up some new kinds of thinking about identity, right? And so, in terms of Black identity, this new category that was created, instead of seeing it as this degraded category of personhood, Baha'u'llah actually took the prevailing conceptions, the stigmas around Blackness, and turned it on its head. So rather than seeing Black people as the site of deprivation and denigration and lack, right, Baha'u'llah establishes this metaphor of Black people being the pupil of the eye, right, a central element of the figurative body of humanity, right, a element of the biological apparatus, which is key to its productive life. And Baha'u'llah said, according to Abdul Baha, his son, that Black people were to be compared to, or let me just read the quotation as Abdul Baha said it. Baha'u'llah once compared colored people to the Black pupil of the eye surrounded by the white. In this Black pupil is seen the reflection of that which is before it, and through it the light of the spirit shineth forth. And so what we have to understand there again is this takes this history, which is born out of incredible exploitation and degradation, and asks us to think about Blackness in a brand new way. And this is quite profound for a couple of reasons, right? Not just because it exists in such contradistinction to the prevailing attitudes of that era, right? But also because of the station of the author of this idea, right? Baha'u'llah, as a Baha'i, I understand to be the King of glory, essentially the prophet of God, which has been promised to humanity since the beginning of prophesying in human history. Baha'u'llah himself said that in this day that he lived, right, it was the King of days, the day that hath seen the coming of the best beloved. That's him, that's Baha'u'llah. Him whom through all eternity hath been acclaimed the desire of the world. All eternity, right, has been waiting for the revelation brought by Baha'u'llah. The world of being shineth in this day with the resplendency of this divine revelation. All created things extol its saving grace and sing its praises. The universe is wrapped in an ecstasy of joy and gladness. The scriptures of past dispensations celebrate the great jubilee that must needs greet this most great day of God. Well is it with him that hath lived to see this day and hath recognized its station. And so, as a person who believes in the truth of the words that are uttered by Baha'u'llah and the greatness of this day that achieves its standing because it is associated with this new revelation, the ideal of the pupil of the eye being associated with blackness is quite profound, right? It's a incredibly powerful kind of intervention into the discourses that permeate the world, right? And that represent just one of the ways in which Baha'u'llah asked people, uh, all people of humanity, to reorient themselves toward issues of identity and history and what we are as humanity, members of the human family. And I think that, one of the things that I believe is that, there's an instructive meaning to this people of the eye metaphor, meaning that you, because Black people were so essential to the rise of the modern world, right? That Baha'u'llah was teaching all of humanity about this history. There was a effort to marginalize Blackness, right, in the history and the development of the modern world, right? But Baha'u'llah instead puts Blackness at the center of this metaphorical body and asks us to think about, how critical Black people have been in the history of humanity. But then I think perhaps, this isn't just an exercise in learning about history for history's sake, right? There's an instrumental purpose to this metaphor, right? And that instrumental purpose is to help us achieve the unification of all of humanity, right? That is the purpose of Baha'u'llah's revelation. So this pupil of the eye metaphor helps us to raise up Black people who we know that in the next 80 years will constitute between 40 and 50% of all human beings on Earth. The way that demographic trends are operating now on a global scale, it's thought that sub-Saharan African people will make up about 40% of all of Earth's population in about 80 years from now, right? And not to say anything of the other Afro-descendant people in other parts of the world, right? So the pupil of the eye, right, is going to very soon actually represent the greatest, single population of people in the entire, human family. And so how can we have a way of being, a way of thinking that degrades, right, the most populous group in the future of all of humanity? It's not going to work, right? We can't create unity in that way. And so we have to have this kind of historical vision, right? And this historical vision helps us to understand a little bit about the turmoil and the chaos that we see that surrounding us today. And we know, particularly Black people sort of look into this history and then they sort of use that history and create analogs with contemporary situations. And we begin to see this direct connection between some of the racial chaos and oppressions that are happening today, right? And connect that back to the past. And of course, there are so many different kinds of examples of the way in which the past seems to haunt the present. And I'll just offer up one, when we had this attack upon the Capitol earlier in the year, there were kinds of efforts to figure out what are the historical analogs that we could compare it to, right? And one of them is known as the Wilmington insurrection or the Wilmington massacre, in which a democratically elected body of state legislators had been installed, and this was a multiracial body of state representatives in that period, in which there was the possibility for Black people to vote. And in the insurrection, the massacre that happened in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, what you see is, essentially the assassination of many people and rioting, in which dozens of Black lives are lost, and this democratically elected body is overthrown essentially within America. And of course, we're not very familiar with that history either, because it's been marginalized, as so much of our history has been. And then add to that, one of the great fomenters of that Wilmington insurrection is this guy named Charles Aycock here, and he went on to have an illustrious career in politics and education after the Wilmington insurrection. And his statue actually stands in the Capitol building of the United States today in Washington, D.C., the Statuary Hall, which is just beneath the place that was sort of overrun on January 6th, has his statue there. And so one can see the great irony in that a figure like that stands in the Capitol building that is meant to be a symbol of the greatness of American democracy. And yet, because of our inability to sort of grapple with the history and figure out what to do about it, it still stands there. And these kinds of situations, like the way in which we see history repeating itself, can create a great degree of consternation and lack of hope for many people. And the primary figure behind the 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah Jones, she came to the colleges where I teach at some months before COVID descended on us, and she was talking about not the 1619 Project so much, but rather some of her reporting on school segregation and the way in which Black children have been so badly underserved by American public schooling systems. And, you could just tell from listening to her talk that she was sort of overwhelmed by the investigative reporting that she had done and the research and the arguments that she was putting forth. And I asked her at the end of the talk that she gave, like, how do you deal with this great sense of injustice that is kind of undeniable, and this unwillingness of of many people to make the kinds of radical changes that are necessary in order for a true sort of egalitarian democracy to exist? And she kind of looked at me and smirked and said, "Scotch." And that was her sort of response, because many people, right, are having trouble envisioning a future, right, within the currently operating structures of society, which will allow us to get past this history. Okay, so you are quite sanguine, quite positive, optimistic person if you can look at the operating structures of our American democracy right now and see a bright horizon on the future, right? It seems to many people that the way forward is only filled with darkness, right? And so as a Baha'i, one of the things that is so central to our work is not really looking to political structures for creating the social change that we want, right? But rather working towards the spiritual transformation of society in ways that are based upon principles of unity and justice that come from the prophet founder of the Baha'i Faith, that are embodied within the revelation of Baha'u'llah. And as a Baha'i, I work toward the transformation of society, not by sort of getting out there into the political arena and demanding change every time we have a opportunity to vote or something like that, but by engaging at the community level with like-minded people who are willing to, in the very moment that we operate in right now, build those structures of society which we want to see in the future, right? So that we prefigure the kinds of communities that we need to see in the future right now. In some ways, some social theorists call this prefigurative politics, right? And Martin Luther King was a kind of advocate of this kind of interaction with society, right? Not to say that he didn't involve himself in political debates and so forth, but one of the things that is quite important about what King said is that the ends are pre-existent in the means, right? The ends where we want to be pre-exist in the means that we use, right? So as a Baha'i, we are trying to build structures of community, right, that are based on principles that we want to see a future civilization embody, right? And so then the question is, this is getting into sort of a practical application of some of these theoretical ideas, is how do we build new structures and new communities, right, which are able to hold this new wine, this new energy, this recognition of the oneness of humanity. And we think that there's a twofold moral process involved here, right? That it's not just about the advocacy of things on the social stage, on the political stage, or the society at large. It's not only that is going to bring about the change that we want, but it's also a transformation of the inner life of each human being, right? Through a process of self-reflection and refinement and prayerful engagement with the divine energy, right? Which asks, and from which we ask to gain kinds of spiritual attributes that might be associated with love and compassion and justice. And as we begin to develop these inner qualities, right, then we engage, or simultaneously we engage with the environment that surrounds us, right? And as we develop these disciplines of the inner life, we can begin to then have a greater impact on the environment that surrounds us, right? And as that environment that surrounds us is impacted by the changes that are taking place in our continual reflection and refinement of our spiritual selves, of these attributes, that of course has an impact on the society. And then when we exist within communities that are characterized by love, justice, and equity, rather than animosity and rancor and hate and so forth, it becomes so much easier to develop these spiritual qualities within, right? So there's this kind of twofold process that we see going on. And, these building processes require an infinite amount of concentration and work and commitment. And we might ask, well, what are the important elements of it? And as Baha'is, we believe that these new community structures, which we're trying to build, need to be characterized by equal attention to the principles of unity and the principles of justice, right? We can have a unified family in which we have a domineering patriarch who holds everyone else in the family in a kind of cowering complacency, right? But that's not a real unity. A real unity, right, is one where every member of the family is equally regarded and comes together on equal footing on a just kind of interaction to create these truly brand new truly brand new kinds of communities and societies that we want to build. A lot of people forget that there's a second part to that parable that Christ told about the old wine, or the new wine and the old wineskins. And he points out that no man, also having drunk old wine, straightway desireth new, right? We don't want, he says, the old, right? He says the old is better. So we don't naturally gravitate to these principles of justice and unity, which are necessary. We want to go back to these old ways that are traditional and that we have grown accustomed to. And so that gives us a kind of that parable. Then, Christ tells us that, the transformation into what is new is not some kind of easy process, something that you can just fall into. It's something that you have to work toward, in fact. To close, I just want to sort of share one story that I like to tell. And I think that it operates in a couple ways. And one of the ways that I want to think about it is that we can begin to operate on these principles of unity and justice, these principles that are part of a new identity that we need to build up as human beings, and that are supplemented by new stories and new histories about who we are. We can do that at a very local level. We begin at the grassroots, so to speak. And I think that there's a reason for that, right? And so I'll tell this little story to kind of exemplify the reasoning that I have uh, for beginning at the grassroots, beginning close to home, right? When I was about 20 years old, I had the opportunity to go visit Baha'i communities in East Africa. And I was primarily in Uganda and Kenya and also in Tanzania. And here's a picture of me in a small village called Ipapa in southern Tanzania. And it was really difficult to get to the village. I think it was like a 5-hour drive from Dar es Salaam, the capital of the city, on a bus. And in this picture, you can see the guy sitting right next to me, Jeveronge was his name. And then there's another guy leaning forward, John was his name. And they were both from Dar es Salaam, and they could speak English and Swahili. And so when I was in Tanzania, they were with me, and I was able to kind of communicate with people in Swahili via Jeveronge and John. And we got off the bus, and then that was 5 hours from Dar es Salaam. And then we walked for about 3 or 4 hours uh, out to this village of Ipapa. So it was very isolated, right? It was, you can see the structures. Like this is like all of the structures in probably 100-mile radius of where we were sitting right at that time, look like this. It was one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in my life, because one night, I remember it so clearly, I got up out and I moved outside of the place where I was staying, the room that I was staying, and I looked up into the sky. And because it's such a light desert, right? There's no electricity anywhere in that region, and Southern Africa itself is so desolate of light at night that when you looked up in the sky, it was incredible to just see a blanket of stars just across. It was like the whole dome of the sky was just filled with stars. It was the embodiment of what is known as sublimity, where you are like overcome with the power and the majesty of creation. I had never ever experienced anything like that. I haven't since then. And so that also gives you an indication of where we were. We were far out in, far away from many, we're far away from people who were speaking Swahili, even, right? The village that I visited, they didn't speak Swahili. And in fact, the only way for us to communicate was through the village elders. And the elders, some of the educated elders, they could speak Swahili. And so John and Jeveronge, when they wanted to kind of convey something to me that someone in the village said, they would have to first ask the village elder what he said, what the person said, and they would translate it into Swahili, and then John and Jeveronge would translate it to English for me. And so one day while we were out there, we went to yet another village, which was about 45 minutes walk away, and we had a prayer gathering. And when we got into that prayer gathering, it was like a big structure, like one of these. It was big, and so it could fit like about 40 or 50 people in it. And I was given the honor of saying the first prayer in this prayer gathering. And, I said my prayer in English, and off in the back of this room, I heard someone sneeze or cough or something. And then After I said the prayer, I think it was John said a prayer in Swahili. And when John said the prayer in Swahili, it was like a couple more people in the back of the room started to cough or sneeze. And then finally, like the head man of that village that we went to, he said a prayer in the local language. And when he said the prayer, the whole room erupted in this coughing and sneezing, right? And so what was evident to me was that the spirit was imbuing the room at that moment. And that was the way in which the people expressed that experience of being moved by the spirit. When I was saying my little prayer in English, there was somebody who was respectful and they were like, okay, you probably had something powerful to say. I'll just give you some expression of the way that I moved. And then when John said it, a couple more people said it. But when finally it was expressed in the language, right, of the people of that area, there was this incredible arousal, right? There was this incredible spiritual expression that burst forth, right? And I say that because, all of us are working within communities that are, the people who are surrounding us, we're close to them. They understand us, right? They can be affected by the spirit in a way that may be more difficult. It might be harder for us to affect people who are far off, with this spirit of a commitment to love and unity and justice, right? And this effort to build new communities. But we can do it, right? We can do it with those who are right next to us, who live with us, who live in our neighborhoods and so forth. And as Baha'is, that's what we're trying to do, is build up these nuclei of like-minded people who are willing to do what they can to live out these principles of love, unity, and justice and equity, and to begin to build a new house, right? Because it seems as though what we inhabit right now is this old house, and it's an old house that's breaking down, and it's not really working for many, many people. And there are some people who are trying to do their best to repair the old house. They're trying to fix this little fixture over here or that room over there. But even as they do that, and I have only love for people who are trying to do that, right? But even as they do that, the house seems to be breaking down, breaking down. And there are some who say that the house we live in is too dangerous to actually continue to live in. And so they advocate for just burning down the whole house. Let's burn it down and start from ground zero, right? And maybe there's some validity to that too, right? There's this idea that when some structure is too dangerous to even inhabit, the only thing you can do is tear it down. But as Baha'is, one of the things that we are trying to do is move into the courtyard of this old house and take the planks and the structure, some of the building material from the old house, and build up something new, right? That can provide shelter and protection and possibility for all of humanity, not just segments of it, right? All of us unified together in one human family. Thanks a lot for spending time with me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. It gave us all a lot to think about, I'm sure. So we have a few questions that were posted in the chat, and we don't really have time to answer all of them. So I'm just going to pose a couple to you, a few. One is from Ted Brownstein, and he said, what new institutions or changes to existing institutions can be created to embody the oneness of humanity?
That's a wonderful question. And I think like the best way or the way that I'll try to answer it is by saying that, as Baha'is, we don't believe that we have like the perfect examples of the institutions right now. But what we have is a blueprint for the creation of institutions that are not characterized by competition and conflict and the attempt to raise up one people at the expense of another people. What we are learning about as communities is how to bring together people in institutions on equal footings so that everyone comes in with some kind of recognition of their sacred status as a human being, and that the teachings of the Baha'i faith that are at the current time orchestrated, you could say, by the universal house of justice, we have this way of understanding and moving forward, which is attempting to find out, to discover, to learn our way into the creation of institutions which can truly embody the oneness of humanity. It's not some kind of silver bullet, right? It's a process of involving as many people as possible in the contribution of knowledge and ideas that we sift through in order to build up that which is going to create this new house for humanity to live within.
Thank you. Okay, another question from Quanta Dawn Light. How can we balance between bringing the darkness of the past to light, at the same time build bright futures for the next generations? As there is a resistance to 1619 and critical race projects, how do we bring unity into the present between the rural poor whites and urban poor blacks as well?
I think creativity is the key here for me. That's what I think. It's I don't dismiss the resistances that people have toward looking into the darkness of the past. I think it's very difficult. It has implications for certain individuals which are not easy to digest. And I think that those of us who are um, advocating for a kind of recognition of a history that has not been told, right? A history from the perspective of the hunted, not the hunter, right? As the African proverb has it, the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter as long as it's the hunter that's telling it, right? The story of the hunt might glorify the lion, right? If it's coming from the perspective of the lion. And I think that that's a difficult process to engage in. Yet at the same time, as much as possible, we have to animate that story with feelings and expressions of love, right? That we're not engaged in telling and offering up this new history, this history that someone from my perspective might construe as being more truthful, right? In a spirit of animosity or angst or hatred, right? It's actually offered up in a spirit of desiring the best for all of humanity. And so there are inevitably going to be challenges and resistances, difficulties in undertaking that project. But again, right, there's no idea, there's no kind of false conception of a silver bullet, right? There's only a recognition that it's through kind of communal endeavor and people being willing to work with one another in ways that are not sort of rancorous and not filled with conflict and contention, but rather aspiring towards visions of unity and togetherness, right? That we're going to achieve some of these new ways of thinking, which I think are necessary for actually building out a human society, transforming human society in a way that does justice to the oneness of humanity.
The last question is, how many people do you think died in slave ships when they were being forced to immigrate here?
Well, there are various numbers on that. There are some people who will put the figure as much as 100 million. There are others at 10 million. Um, it is whatever the number, right? It is a tragedy, right, and a reality which is unfathomable, right? We can't even whether regardless of the number of people, right? It was a destruction of humanity on a scale that was incredible. But the other thing that we have to remember, right, is it's not just like this material physical devastation which occurred in the process of the Middle Passage, right? It is a process that scholars have begun to call epistemicide, right? So it wasn't just a kind of like genocide of the killing off of people. It was also the killing off of ways of being, ways of knowing, right? Epistemology, right, are ways of understanding the world and what we do as human beings to live successfully in the world. And in the process of killing off people, right, there was the killing off of ways of knowing as well. in some of the oral tradition, in the oral cultures of West Africa, there is this idea that when an old person dies, it's as though a library is burning, right? So imagine, right, the millions upon millions of libraries that were burnt, right, in that process of the Middle Passage and the creation of this new world. So we as a collective humanity, right, have lost the benefit of all of these epistemologies which have been destroyed and degraded in the uplifting of essentially, one epistemology, one way of thinking, of knowing, of being, right? Or not just one, but primarily one associated with these cultures of Europe that were, ascendant in that particular period of human history. So I would say, even beyond the material devastation, part of what we are dealing with now is the effects of the killing off of spiritual conceptions, right? Insights, wisdoms, knowledges that are so necessary right now, right? We understand that, probably everyone in this room is aware of the way in which the materialistic view that is dominant in the world today is leading us down paths that are unsustainable and that might lead to, incredible devastation for all of humanity. And yet we don't seem to have the means, the tools, right, to really become spiritualized. And yet, in all of these cultures that have been marginalized and degraded in the process of colonialization and so forth that characterize the new world, we can find such effective tools for the creation of a synchronous existence with, the world of nature and, human societies. And it's not that those have to be sort of put forward uh, in place of what we have now. What we have to have is a kind of synthesis, and this is very difficult, right? A synthesis of these various ways of knowing that can lead us into a future which is going to sort of ensure our survival, essentially.